Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in here as we continue on with our creative writing course. So we are looking at our next workshop coming up here, which is our poetry workshop. So we're into a new genre out of creative nonfiction back into, I guess, a purer form of fiction, although poetry sort of exists outside of that continuum between like a short story and a creative nonfiction essay, if only because the form is so different. And so one of the things that we now get to play with in a much more sort of intense or obvious way is not just the words that we write, but how those exist on the page. And the simplest example of that is line breaks. And often the most distinguishing feature between prose and poetry is simply its existence on the page, the way it looks. And so that introduces a whole new a set of concerns for us, but not, problems. Think of them as opportunities, things that you can work with as a writer, as a creative writer. So things like line breaks and line lengths and how you break up stanzas, the pieces of verse within a poem. All of that stuff is opportunity or tools that you can work with that aren't necessarily available in an obvious way in the writing that we've done so far. So be sure you're really conscious of how your poem exists on the page, what it looks like, how it's broken up, not just at the end of lines, but in terms of stanzas as well. It's a really good opportunity, as is noted in the unit, to also review the whoops, I just got to find myself into the right unit here. To review the rules of poetry or the rules of creative writing that we've talked about, either specifically all at once or that have sort of been scattered throughout the course, because I think poetry is one of the most intimidating, if not the most intimidating genre that we cover, because people have so many odd assumptions about poetry. And I think, from my perspective, this comes from the fact that most people learn what a short story is and how it sounds and how it looks on the page and all of that kind of stuff from actually reading short stories, or more often novels, but that kind of tone and style and just how those things exist. But think about how often you just sit down to read poetry. Probably never, right? Or not very often. But when you sit down as a writer to write it, you obviously have these conceptions of like what it's supposed to sound like, how it's supposed to look, the tone of it, the subject matter, and all that kind of stuff. So where did you learn those assumptions? How did you formulate those? And I think for most people, consciously or otherwise, they learn poetry from music, from song lyrics. And of course, there's lots of great poetic song lyrics, but most of what circulates in terms of pop music really isn't good poetry. In fact, it's terrible. That's not to say it's not good music, because obviously a song is not just lyrics. It has all of this other stuff going on. And particularly for us now, it often has this big visual component too, where you have access not just to the lyrics, not just to the music even, but to this whole visual dimension to it as well. And a good kind of anecdote to think about here is how often you might have a favorite song, or somebody who has this absolute favorite song, and pressed to recite the lyrics to you, they might know a few of them, but not all. And an even more funny example is when people don't know the lyrics, or they misknow the lyrics. They think it's one thing, but it's actually another. It just goes to show that a song can be really impactful and really important for an individual, but also just culturally, regardless of the lyrics. In other words, regardless of the poetry, there's so much else going on that's captivating, that's interesting, whether it's the instrumentation, the tempo, the kind of atmosphere of the whole thing, all of that. So the point is to be really aware of what you bring to the table in terms of your assumptions about poetry, and how a lot of those, I bet, are rooted in your experience with song lyrics and songs and music, and really to be aware of how often song lyrics tend to steer us in the wrong direction when it comes to writing poems. So the short version of all that is to really pay attention to the rules of poetry here that are kind of rehashing the rules of creative writing that we've talked about, and to try to let go of the assumptions you have about what poetry is supposed to be, what it has to sound like. It doesn't have to rhyme. Particularly simple end rhymes, here, near, fear, gear. Just words like that. People think that to be a poem you have to have that, when in fact that tendency tends to make for worse poetry, because you end up sort of fitting lines so that you can arrive to this word that you want to use, and the end rhymes are very simplistic, and the poem doesn't seem to have a nice flow because all of the lines just end with that rhyme. So something as simple as that, a very common assumption, really oftentimes makes for kind of bad poetry. So, right, think about those assumptions that you bring to the table and really try to let them go. Almost start from the ground up in terms of learning poetry as poetry, not as just a version of song lyrics or of some other thing that you've had experience with. Having said that, though, outside of the rules of poetry that are included here, there's really no rules as far as, again, tone, subject matter. So you can have a humorous poem, you can have a serious poem, you can have a poem about something that's just kind of an everyday occurrence. It doesn't need to be about this grandiose event. Again, one of the assumptions about poetry that people often bring to the table, and I'm not sure this is from the whole music problem exactly, but the other way that poetry exists culturally for us, not just as lyrics, it will often show up at very important occasions, which is one of the, to me, the most interesting, dilemmas about poetry, or sort of counterintuitive things, is that it really doesn't figure as part of people's everyday lives. They don't read it on an everyday basis or think that they encounter it, even though I think that we do. But when it comes to this big, momentous event, a wedding, a funeral, a graduation or important day, right? What do we defer to? What genre do we go to? We don't write a short story. We don't write a novel. We write a poem, or usually recite a poem, or some form of verse that has become famous. If you've ever been to a wedding, I guarantee you've heard verse, and it's probably been that Ecclesiastes bit about faith, hope, and love, or faith, hope, and charity, depending on what translation you're using. But it's interesting that poetry exists for us in these very important occasions, right? So again, that's an assumption that people bring to the table when it comes to writing poetry, that it has to be big and grandiose and important, and it has to address some momentous universal problem. Again, some poetry does that. Some poetry does it well, although very limited numbers of poems do that. But mostly that impulse to be elevated, to be grandiose, to be noble, it usually leads people down the wrong path as far as creating good, accessible, interesting poems. So yet another assumption that you want to be aware of and then sort of leave behind as you enter into the poetry workshop here. Okay, practically speaking then, the workshop is no different than ones we've done before. It's really important that you post on time as a file. And you'll notice that the groups are a little bit bigger here because people aren't posting 5 or 10-page stories for you to read. They're posting probably just a poem. So you'll be responsible for responding to a lot more people, but overall it's really not more work than we've done before, since the length of material that you're responding to is fairly limited. So poetry can be intimidating. It can seem difficult, like you're either born with the knack for it or not, but simply not the case. It's a skill, it's a kind of writing that you get better at by doing. The only thing to be aware of, in addition to the assumptions that you're bringing to the table and how unhelpful those can be a lot of the time, is that because a poem exists in so few words on the page, you really have to be, more so with poetry than with any other genre that we write in, you really have to be conscious that every single word is doing some work for you. So you really don't want a lot of extra stuff in there, or meandering stuff or repetitive stuff. You just have to be very careful. So what is communicated in a 10-page story, whether it's the idea, the emotion, the conflict, all of that stuff, you can do the same in poetry, but instead of 10 pages worth of words, you're going to have a page, if that, worth of words. So everything becomes kind of intensified in poetry, and I think that's precisely why people get a little bit nervous about it. They're just not sure how to handle that level of intensity on the word-by-word basis. But don't be overwhelmed. Read through the rules here and approach poetry really with an open mind, not with it has to sound this way, or it has to be about this certain thing, or it has to rhyme, or it has to have this elevated diction like it's all of a sudden people getting Shakespearean. They didn't talk like that in Shakespeare's time, and certainly we don't talk like that now. So we don't need a bunch of inverted word order and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. So in some ways poetry is a lot simpler than people treat it, and maybe that's the best place to start. Okay, so enjoy our poetry workshop, and I will be in touch if you have any questions, and I will be back in touch as we actually get towards the end of our course. All right, take care.